The Japinha of CV, the woman who defied the underworld. There's a heavy silence that hangs over Rio's favelas when her name is whispered. It's not ordinary fear. It's something deeper, more visceral. It's the kind of terror that makes mothers pull their children inside and armed men lower their gaze. Because when you speak of the Japinha of CV, you're not just talking about another criminal. You're talking about the woman who broke every rule of a world where women shouldn't exist in command, and who did it by spilling more blood than many men would dare to imagine. Her real name, few know. To the criminal world, she was always just Japinha, a nickname that carries cruel irony, since her Asian features contrast brutally with the savagery of her methods. At 35, she doesn't just lead one of the most feared factions of the Red Command, she completely redefined what it means to be cruel in the Brazilian underworld. And it all began in a place where no one would expect to find one of the country's most calculating criminal minds. Her story doesn't start with gunshots or drugs. It begins with a 12-year-old girl sitting on a bench in a public school in Duque de Caxias, Baixada Fluminense, a girl who drew flowers in the margins of her notebooks and dreamed of being a veterinarian. A girl whose biggest problem should have been next week's math test, but fate has cruel ways of rewriting dreams, and hers would be rewritten with blood and gunpowder. The first sign that something was wrong appeared when she was 14. It wasn't her grades dropping, nor the typical rebellious behavior of adolescence. It was something more subtle, more disturbing. It was the way she observed, how her eyes fixed on people with an intensity that made adults feel uncomfortable. How she could read human weaknesses with a precision that frightened even the most experienced teachers. Her parents, Japanese immigrants who worked 16 hours a day in a small restaurant, didn't notice when she started skipping classes. They didn't notice when she began coming home with clothes too expensive for the family income. And when they finally realized, it was too late. The girl who dreamed of caring for wounded animals had found a very different calling. She discovered she had a talent for hurting people. At 15, she witnessed her first execution in a nearby alley. Any normal person would have run in the opposite direction, but Akemi hid behind a garbage container and watched. 2 men were torturing a third, demanding information about a stolen drug shipment. She watched for 20 minutes, analyzing each method, each reaction, each psychological break. When they finally shot the victim in the head, she didn't feel disgust or horror. She felt curiosity. That night she couldn't sleep, not from trauma, but from excitement. She had found her calling. But that still wasn't the most terrifying demonstration of her cruelty. The origins. Akemi's first real test came when she was 15. One of the drug dealers she did favors for, a man called Rato, had been arrested with a considerable amount of cocaine. The police were pressuring him to give up information about the distribution network, and everyone knew it was a matter of time before he broke. Akemi observed the tense meetings, the worried whispers, the growing desperation in the criminals' eyes. They needed a solution, but none of them had the courage or intelligence to find one. That's when she offered to solve the problem. "Leave it to me," she said, with a calm that made the adult men look at each other uncomfortably. She was 15 years old and weighed less than 50 kilos, but there was something in her voice that made them believe she knew exactly what she was doing. Her plan was simple and brutal. Rato had an 8-year-old daughter who studied at a public school 3 blocks from the police station where he was imprisoned. Akemi spent a week studying the girl's routine, then approached the child at school dismissal. "Your father sent a message," said Akemi, crouching down to the girl's height. "He said that if you don't tell your mother that he needs to stay quiet in jail, very bad things will happen to both of you." The child, scared and confused, ran home and told her mother everything. The next day, the woman visited Rato in prison and transmitted the message. He understood immediately. His family was being threatened. If he talked, they would die. Rato never opened his mouth. He was sentenced to 8 years in prison, but his family remained alive, and Akemi had proven she could solve problems that experienced men couldn't. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the plan's efficiency. It was the coldness with which she executed it. Threatening an 8-year-old child required a type of cruelty that went beyond simple lack of empathy. It required an ability to see other human beings as pieces on a chessboard, useful only as long as they served her purposes. In the following months, she began receiving more complex consultations. A rival drug dealer was invading territory. Akemi discovered secrets about his personal life and used them as blackmail. A police officer was being inconvenient. She found ways to compromise him without direct violence. Someone owed money and refused to pay. She created situations that made payment the only viable option. At 16, she was already known as the girl who solves problems. But she was still seen as a tool, not as a leader. That would change very soon. The turning point came when the local drug point chief, a man called Caveron, decided she knew too much. He had realized that Akemi had information about all the organization's members, knew all the secrets, all the weaknesses. She had become too dangerous to remain alive. What she did in the next 48 hours would transform an intelligent teenager into one of Rio de Janeiro's most feared criminals. The first signs. The war began in silence, like all truly dangerous wars. Akemi had 48 hours to eliminate a threat that could destroy her, but instead of acting out of desperation, she saw an opportunity. Caveron wasn't just an obstacle, he was the gateway to something much bigger. She spent the first night mapping the entire power structure of the local faction. Not just names and positions, but personal relationships, internal rivalries, the secrets each one kept. Akemi had spent 2 years observing and collecting information, and now it was time to use that arsenal. Caveron had 3 lieutenants, Marcom, Dente de Oro, and Piranha. Each controlled a specific part of the territory, but all harbored secret ambitions to take the boss's place. Akemi knew this because she had observed the tense conversations, the looks of contempt, the small betrayals they thought no one noticed. Her plan was simple: make them destroy each other, leaving the path clear for her to assume control. She started with Marcon, who had a gambling addiction that was leading him to bankruptcy. Akemi discovered he had taken money from the drug point to cover betting debts, something Caveron was unaware of. She didn't need to do anything but leave some evidence in the right place for Dente de Oro to find. When Dente de Oro took the evidence to Caveron, the reaction was explosive. Marcon was tortured until he confessed and then executed in a session that lasted 3 hours. Akemi watched from afar, analyzing each method, each psychological break, each moment when the victim lost hope. The war between the remaining lieutenants was brutal and quick. They killed each other in conflicts that Akemi orchestrated through carefully planted information and manipulated situations. In less than a month, all 3 were dead, and Caveron was vulnerable and paranoid. That's when Akemi decided to reveal herself. She appeared at his house on a Tuesday night, alone and unarmed. Caveron was watching television when she entered through the front door, a door that should have been locked and protected by 2 guards. "Where are my men?" he asked, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his waist. "Sleeping," replied Akemi, with the same calm she would use to talk about the weather. "I put a sleeping pill in their beer, nothing permanent, just enough for us to have a private conversation." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. Caveron tried to negotiate, threaten, bribe. Akemi simply listened, analyzing every word, every gesture, every sign of weakness. When he finally understood he had no choice, she made a proposal he couldn't refuse. "You can die today like your men died," she said, "or you can live as my employee. The choice is yours." Caveron chose to live, and with that choice, Akemi became, at 16, the chief of one of the most profitable drug points in Duca de Caxias. But this was just the beginning. She had much bigger plans. The escalation. Akemi's first year in command was a masterclass in criminal psychology. She tripled everyone's salaries, implemented a promotion system based on merit, and established clear rules applied consistently. In 6 months, her operation had become the most efficient in the region. Profits increased 400%, violence decreased dramatically, and even the local police began to see her as a lesser evil. But Akemi wasn't satisfied with being just another drug point chief. She had studied the Red Command structure and identified its weaknesses. The organization was powerful, but disorganized. Each faction operated independently, creating internal conflicts and resource waste. She saw an opportunity to centralize power and create something much more efficient. At 17, she began absorbing other operations through strategic manipulation. Her first target was Carlinhos de Baixada, a veteran drug dealer who controlled 3 points in Nova Iguaçu. He had a problem. A son addicted to crack who was constantly creating problems. Instead of threatening, Akemi helped the boy, paid for treatment, provided psychological counseling, even got him a legitimate job. Carlinhos was so grateful that when she suggested a partnership, he accepted without hesitation. In less than a year, the partnership had transformed into a complete absorption. The second target was more challenging. Dona Marlene was one of the few women in command of Rio's drug trade, a veteran who had survived 3 decades of urban warfare. Akemi requested a meeting and went personally to Marlene's territory, alone and unarmed. "You have balls," said Marlene after hearing Akemi's proposal. "But balls aren't enough in this business. You need experience and you don't have it." "True," agreed Akemi, "but you have experience and I have ideas. Together we can create something neither of us could achieve alone." The conversation lasted 6 hours. In the end, they had formed an alliance that would completely change the landscape of organized crime in Baixada Fluminense. At 18, Akemi directly or indirectly controlled more than 15 drug points. Her monthly profits exceeded R500,000. She had become one of the most powerful figures in Rio's organized crime, but power attracted attention, and not all attention was welcome. The crime. Akemi's mistake was underestimating envy. Caveirão, the man she had spared and transformed into a subordinate, was secretly orchestrating her downfall. He had spent 2 years feigning loyalty while collecting information about her operations. The betrayal came on a March night in 2019. Akemi was returning from a meeting with Colombian suppliers when her car was intercepted by armed men, her own men, led by Caveirão. "Nothing personal, boss," he said, pointing a pistol at her head, "but a girl shouldn't be commanding real men." They took her to an abandoned warehouse in Queimados, where they intended to torture her until she revealed the location of all the money and drugs. But Akemi had foreseen this possibility. She had implanted a subcutaneous tracking chip and established emergency protocols with Dona Marlene. For 8 hours, they tried to break her. They used electric shocks, simulated drowning, cigarette burns. Caveirão was increasingly frustrated with her resistance, with her refusal to beg or cry. She answered questions with monosyllables, maintained constant eye contact, and occasionally even smiled. A cold smile that made the torturers feel uncomfortable. "You don't understand the situation," screamed Caveirão. "You're going to die here. No one will save you." "I know," replied Akemi with unshakable calm, "but you're going to die too. The only difference is that I'm going to watch you die." The answer came at 6 a.m. when the warehouse doors exploded. Dona Marlene had arrived with 15 armed men. The shootout lasted less than 10 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 7 of Caveirão's men were dead, and Caveirão himself was on his knees, begging for mercy. Akemi was freed, but something had changed in her during those 8 hours of torture. It wasn't trauma, it was something much more dangerous. It was rage. A cold, calculated rage that had crystallized into a thirst for revenge. "Leave him to me," she said to Marlene. What happened in the next 3 hours transformed Akemi into an urban legend. It transformed an intelligent criminal into a monster, and gave birth to the creature the world would know as the Japinha of CV. The impact, what Akemi did to Cavirão in that warehouse, was never fully documented, but the fragments that leaked created a mythology of terror in Rio's underworld. Witnesses reported screams that lasted hours, interspersed with periods of silence that were even more disturbing. Marlene, a woman who had witnessed decades of urban violence, left the warehouse vomiting and refused to talk about what she saw for the rest of her life. Cavirão's body was found 3 days later. The medical report listed 47 different wounds, all individually non-fatal, but which together created a picture of prolonged and meticulous suffering. Even more disturbing, forensic evidence indicated he had remained conscious during almost the entire process. When Akemi emerged from the warehouse, she was no longer the same person. Physically, her injuries were superficial. Psychologically, something fundamental had broken, or perhaps finally been freed. "How do you feel?" asked Marlene. "Complete," replied Akemi, and the smile that accompanied that word made Marlene accelerate the car. Akemi's reputation changed overnight. Before, she was respected for her intelligence and efficiency. Now, she was feared for something much more primitive, the ability to inflict suffering in ways that defied human imagination. The first test of the new Akemi came 2 weeks later, when a rival drug dealer called Zé Pequeno tried to invade one of her territories. He was kidnapped in broad daylight and returned 12 hours later, alive but unrecognizable. He had lost 3 fingers, had cigarette burns forming the word respect on his chest, and his eyes had an expression of absolute terror. When pressed about what had happened, he simply whispered, "You don't understand. She's not human." At 19, she had completely transformed. The girl who dreamed of being a veterinarian had become a predator who saw other human beings as breakable toys. It was around this time that she officially adopted the name Japinha do CV. And then came the episode that would transform her from a regional criminal into a national legend. The investigation. The episode that transformed Japinha from regional criminal to national legend began with a betrayal she didn't see coming. Donna Marlene, her mentor and most trusted ally, had been secretly co-opted by a rival Red Command faction. The discovery came through a casual phone interception. One of Japinha's men had captured a conversation where Marlene discussed details about distribution routes and weak points in the operation. There was no doubt the woman who had saved her life was now planning her destruction. For any normal person, this revelation would be devastating. For Japinha, it was liberating. Marlene was the last connection she maintained to any vestige of humanity. With this betrayal, even that connection was definitively severed. The revenge she planned didn't target just Marlene, but the entire structure that had allowed the betrayal. For 3 months, she planted informants in Marlene's organization through psychological seduction. She identified men with frustrated ambitions, women with family problems, young people with dreams of rapid ascension. For each one, she offered exactly what they most desired. When she finally attacked, it was like a virus that corrodes the system from within. In a single night, 15 key members of Marlene's organization simply disappeared. They weren't killed, they were converted. Marlene woke up to discover that her organization had collapsed overnight. For 2 weeks, Japinha allowed Marlene to flee, always keeping her at a safe distance. It was a psychological cat-and-mouse game designed to break the victim's mental resistance before the final confrontation. Finally, desperate and exhausted, Marlene made the mistake Japinha was waiting for. She sought refuge at her daughter's house, a 25-year-old young woman who worked as a nurse and had no involvement with organized crime. Japinha orchestrated a situation where Marlene would be forced to choose between her own life and her daughter's life. The trap was set with surgical precision. Japinha's men kidnapped Marlene's daughter and sent a simple message. Marlene had 24 hours to surrender alone and unarmed at a specific location. If she didn't show up, the daughter would die slowly. Marlene appeared at the designated location, an abandoned warehouse in Duke de Caxias, exactly at the specified time. Japinha was waiting, sitting in a chair in the center of the empty space, with Marlene's daughter tied up a few meters away. What happened in the next 4 hours would become the darkest legend of Brazilian organized crime: the trial. The final confrontation between Japinha and Marlene wasn't an execution. It was a lesson in the anatomy of power and betrayal. Japinha had spent weeks planning not just how Marlene would die, but how she would completely understand the meaning of her death. "You taught me many things," began Japinha, walking slowly around the chair where Marlene was tied. "You taught me that in this world, loyalty is the only currency that really matters. You taught me that trust is a luxury few can afford to have. And now you've taught me the most important lesson of all." "What lesson?" asked Marlene, trying to keep her voice steady. "That even the people we love are capable of destroying us." What followed was a demonstration of psychological cruelty that redefined the limits of what a human mind can conceive. Japinha didn't physically torture either of the two women. Instead, she tortured them emotionally, forcing Marlene to make impossible choices that corroded her sanity with each decision. First, she offered a simple choice. Marlene could save her daughter's life by publicly confessing all her crimes in a video that would be sent to the police. Marlene accepted immediately, but Japinha laughed and said it was just the beginning. The second choice was more complex. Marlene should call each of her former allies and convince them to surrender to Japinha. For each person who refused, her daughter would lose a finger. Marlene made the calls, begging, crying, offering everything she had. Some accepted, others refused. The daughter lost 3 fingers. The third choice completely broke Marlene's resistance. She should choose which of the two would die first. If she refused to choose, both would die slowly. If she chose the daughter, she herself would be spared for a few more hours. If she chose herself, the daughter would be freed. Marlene chose herself, obviously, but Japinha had lied. She never intended to free the daughter. The choice was just another form of psychological torture. "Did you really believe I would leave a witness alive?" asked Japinha, seeing the despair in Marlene's eyes. "You know me better than that." Marlene's execution was quick, a shot to the head that killed her instantly. But the daughter was kept alive for 2 more hours, forced to watch while Japinha methodically dismembered her mother's body, explaining each cut as if it were an anatomy lesson. When she finally killed the daughter, Japinha did it with the same clinical coldness with which she had tortured the mother. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just the efficient conclusion of a necessary task. The bodies were found 3 days later, arranged in a way that told the whole story without need for explanations. The police immediately understood they were dealing with something beyond a simple crime of passion. At 20, she had become Rio de Janeiro's most feared criminal. But more importantly, she had discovered there were no limits to her own cruelty inside the criminal's mind. Today, at 35, Japinha controls an empire that extends far beyond Rio's favelas. Her network reaches into police stations, courts, and government offices. She has become more than a criminal. She has become an institution, a dark force that shapes the reality of millions of people. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of her story isn't the violence or the cruelty. It's how easily a human being can transform into something unrecognizable. Akemi began as a girl with dreams, with the potential to heal and help. Every choice she made, every line she crossed, seemed logical at the time. Small steps that led to an abyss so deep that return became impossible. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature. How many of us, faced with the same circumstances, the same choices, the same opportunities for power, would make different decisions? How thin is the line that separates civilization from savagery? Japinha represents something that exists in the shadows of every society, the potential for absolute corruption, the capacity for evil that lies dormant in the human heart. She is a reminder that monsters aren't born. They are created, choice by choice, compromise by compromise, until nothing human remains. In the favelas of Rio, children still whisper her name in the dark, not as a bogeyman, but as something much more real and terrifying. She is proof that in a world without justice, without hope, without opportunities, some people will create their own rules. And those rules are written in blood. The girl who dreamed of saving animals became the woman who destroys lives. The child who drew flowers in notebook margins became the architect of nightmares. And perhaps that transformation tells us more about the world we live in than we're comfortable admitting. Reflective conclusion. Japinha's story isn't just about crime. It's about what happens when society fails its children, when poverty becomes desperation, when desperation becomes rage, and when rage finds intelligence to guide it. She is both product and producer of the violence that consumes our cities. And the most disturbing part, she's still out there, still growing her empire, still writing new chapters in blood, because once you become a monster, there's no going back to being human. In the end, the Japinha of CV represents our collective failure as a society. She is what we create when we abandon our children to the streets, when we offer no alternatives to violence, when we allow desperation to flourish in the shadows of our cities. She is the mirror that reflects our darkest truths. Her empire continues to grow, her influence continues to spread, and her legend continues to inspire both terror and a twisted form of respect. She has become something beyond human comprehension, a force of nature that reshapes everything it touches. The girl who once drew flowers has become the woman who plants seeds of destruction. And in the favelas of Rio, those seeds continue to grow, nurtured by the same conditions that created her. Perhaps that's the most terrifying lesson of all, that in the right circumstances, any of us could become the monster we fear most. If this story intrigued you, subscribe to the channel to learn about other real crimes that shock the world and the minds behind them.